Hey guys, so today I thought I'd do a quick video as a cleanup from some of our previous code on the message board. It's not going to be adding features, but it's going to be exploring features that React Router has to offer to help clean up our code in regards to our authentication and our loading of our data. So as you can see here in our index, we have this new loading component and we have a new authenticated component. So with loading component, authenticated component, what's happening here is that before we enter this switch statement, we're going to load all of our data. And then after that, we're going to go into our switch statement. And then if we want to hide something behind an authentication tab, we render this component. So if we were to have, something like in the future where we want to be able to see posts with an ID, we could do something like this. And what that will allow is that will allow this route to also be protected by authorization. Or if you wanted, something like user with an ID. So what this will allow us to do is it will allow us to very easily simplify our code for authentication purposes. So now we won't have to do checks in each component. We're doing a top level check before we ever get into the component at all. This is a lot cleaner and it's much easier to understand. So we're going to have a quick look initially into our authenticated component, our loading component, and then I'm going to pull down the project from where we were last time, and we'll start from there. We'll code it up. I also am going to have the completed code on GitHub under branch video 4, and if you want to just skip the video and look at that, that's perfectly fine. So first, we're going to look at the loading component. So what we've added now is we've added a new concept of a loading reducer, and we've added the ability to check if the posts or the user is loading. Since they're asynchronous, it's very possible to load the page up before you've ever loaded anything at all. So what this does is it says if the loading user is undefined, which means we've never tried to get the user before, we're going to get the user. And if the posts is undefined, we're going to get the posts. So this is very simple in the fact that if we've never tried to load the post, we load the post. If we've never tried to load the user, we load the user. Now, this one's a little different. The reason we have to check, the reason it's -1 is because if you're not authenticated and you try and receive posts, it doesn't throw an error, it just won't do it. It'll say, I'm still trying to load the posts. But there is a callback function that you can call or that you can attach. And what you'll say is, hey, I've tried getting my posts, but I can't. So I'm going to return a status of -1, and once we've authenticated, which is the user is not equal to null, once we've authenticated, we'll try again, and that should be able to get the posts at that point. So then what we do is we say, if the users and the posts are done loading, or the user is null, we should render the children, which means we're done loading. Otherwise, we're going to return a loading spinner or a loading div or something just to signify the fact that we're loading. And that's all that there is to do with the loading page or the loading component. And then the authorization component is very similar. We have a component did update, which says if the user or if we're done loading the user and there's not a user, just go back to the login page. Otherwise, we're just going to render the rest of the page, or we're going to render the rest of what React Router wants to render. So that's what this is doing. We're saying we're going to render children, which if you go back to index is route path. But if we had multiple routes, it would try and render them all. And then it would just go to the first one it found. And then we're going to also render null otherwise. And if we render null, it just doesn't show anything on the screen. Now I want to talk about this with router. So we haven't seen this before, but what with router does is if something changes in here, without encasing it in with router, it won't send should update to authenticated component. Since we're using Redux, we don't want to tamper with that component should update. So what with router does is it says, hey, whenever I update here, this is considered a router component. So make sure to tell this component and this component that we've updated. That's all that it does. So now that we've done a quick demo of the main components of the code, I'm going to pull down the project and we're going to start coding from where we were last time. So if you haven't seen the rest of the videos, you can start right with me. So I'm going to go to my GitHub page, which is github.com/TaylorRayHoward. And then it's going to be react-redux message board. And then we're going to clone. We're going to copy this link. And then we're going to come down here. We're going to go to a terminal. And I'm going to go back because I have it pulled down already. So I'm going to remove my react-redux message board. And then I'm going to git clone. I'm going to pull it down. So then we're going to cd into react-redux message board. We're going to git checkout video 3. Like I said before, video 4 is the completed code. Video 3 is the code that I'm going to run through now, or start from and then go to video 4. And then we're going to do npm install. Now that we're through installing it, we're going to see what it looked like before. So as you can see, we just have a simple switch statement, and we have an ending browser router, and that's it. So we're going to run quickly into our list posts method, which is our home method, basically. And we're going to see what we're doing. So we're saying in the component we'll mount, we'll try and get the post, we'll try and get the user. If props.user.loading is false and the email is undefined, obviously this doesn't make very much sense. That means that we're going to have to do this in every single component. We're going to have to check if the next props is, done loading and stuff like that. This is just not a great way to do it. So what we're going to do is we're going to delete all this code. And then we're also going to go into the post reducer. And we're going to, the user reducer. And then we're going to delete inside this state. And then we're just going to delete everything except for action.payload. We don't need the idea of loading here anymore. We're going to create our own reducer for loading itself. So that way we're not having to put loading in every single reducer. It would be a mess. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new JavaScript file, and it's going to be the loading reducer. Now, what I like to do is I like to delete the comments at the top. I like to copy from another reducer, paste it in, get rid of all the import statements, and then just have the default return statement. This is what every reducer will look like, so it's not too bad to copy and paste them. So that we've got our user reducer, we want to go to our reducers index. We want to make sure that we are actually connecting this to our global store, and we're going to call this loading, and we're going to attach it to the loading reducer. Once you do this, you're going to make sure to import it. Now that we've done that, we're going to actually want to dispatch actions to our reducer. How useful is a reducer if you're not dispatching any actions? We're going to start with the post reducer, or the post actions. And you can see here that we're already dispatching whenever we get a type of fetch post, whenever we get our posts. So what we're going to do is we're going to dispatch whenever this method is called that we are loading. Whenever we're done loading, we're going to dispatch again and say, hey, we're not loading anymore. So what we're going to do is we're going to dispatch, and we're going to create a constant type up here. So export const post status is equal to post status. And then it's going to be of type post status, and the payload will be true. So all we're saying here is that, hey, I'm loading because we've called this method. So whenever we come in here, if we receive database on value, that means we've got all of our posts, and we're going to dispatch that action. So what we're going to do is we're going to dispatch another action that says, hey, we're going to say post status again is the same type. Hey, I'm done loading. So we're no longer loading. Now, this is the callback function that I was talking about. So as you can see here, database.onValue. So you can pass in another callback function. That's what this is doing. Basically, we're saying, hey, we're going to attach this function. And if it, basically for us, it's going to say, if it fails, do this. But it's not throwing an error. It's just a different type of function. So we're going to dispatch the same type of post status. And our payload this time is going to be -1. Now, as I said earlier, this -1 signifies that I've tried to load, but I couldn't. So I'm going to wait until you've changed something, and I'm going to try again. So this -1 signifies, hey, I've tried before. I'm going to try again in the future. So since we have this post status type now, we're going to need to go to our loading reducer. And since we're switching on action.type, we're going to do case user underscore status. We're going to do case, not caps, case post status. I'm going to make sure to import that. And then we're going to return state and posts action.payload. So basically what we've said is we want to keep track of the old state, but we want to make sure that we keep up with our new posts loading state, basically. So we're going to be able to have a global loading store that says, hey, all of these things are loading if it's true, and all of these things are done loading if it's false. So now what we've done is we've said, hey, we're loading or we're not loading for posts. So we're going to need to do the same thing for users. So we're going to go here. We're going to dispatch. And obviously, we're going to need to create a new constant. Export const user status is equal to user status. So we're going to export a type of user status, a payload of true. So what we've said here again is that, hey, I've called this method, we're loading. And when we're done here, we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to copy and paste it. And we're going to do a payload of false. Now, on all state change is not the same as get the data from the database, because on all state change is always going to be able to be called. You're either authenticated or you're not. It doesn't depend upon anything. Like our posts depend on if you're authenticated or not, if you can get them. So now we're going to go into our loading reducer. We're going to go case user status return state, and our user is action.payload. And as always, you need to make sure to import. All right, so now we've got our Redux all set up. So now we are always going to be able to know if we're loading or we're not loading. We need to also make sure to go into our loading screen, or our loading component, and strip out anything, strip out this. So now that we've got that out of the way, we're going to start creating our new components. So as before, you saw we had a new loading component. So I like to call I called it the loading component, which isn't a great name, but you need to make sure to denote it as a different kind of component, because it's not necessarily the same thing as, like my login component actually serves a purpose of, rendering JSX on the screen. This is more of a action or a workflow step. So it's, hey, I want to load and then just render everything else. The same thing with authentication. Hey, I want to check if I'm authenticated, then render everything else. So you want to make sure. I added the word component. That's not probably a very good way to do it. But just for consistency's sake, I am going to name it the loading component, because I've already pushed this code and I don't want to have to merge it. So we're going to call it the loading component. Okay. So as always, we're going to want to import React. And then this is going to be a class-based component. So we're going to need to import component from React. You're going to want to import connect from react-redux, because we're going to want to connect this to the global store. And we're going to want to import with router from React Router DOM. Because as I said earlier, we want to make sure that these get updated whenever React Router does. Basically, we want to receive the fact that React Router is wanting to try and update everything else. So we're also going to want to import get user from actions/user. Actions/user actions. And then we're going to also want to import get posts from actions/post actions. So this should be all the imports we need. Not of. We're going to do class loading component extends component. And in our component will mount, we're going to have a component will mount function. We're not going to do it just yet. We're going to have a component will receive props function with next props. And then we're also going to have a render function. And then we're also going to have a map state to props function. And we're going to need our loading on it. And we're we're going to need our user. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to destructure this even a little bit more. So we're going to say user loading is equal to loading dot user state dot loading dot user, and then we're going to do posts loading is state dot loading dot posts. We'll do some enter statements here so everything's cleaned up a little bit. And then we're going to want to do our connect function, which is export default with router, because we want to make sure this updates with React Router. Connect, map state to props. And then we're going to do our action creators, get user and get posts. And then we'll do our loading component. So what we've said, I'll quickly run over this, is that we're wanting to map our state to our props of state.loading.user will be called user loading. State.loading.posts will be called post loading. And then we'll get the user off of the state. And then we're going to export our default with React Router, and we'll connect that to our global store. So in our component will mount function, we're going to do const user loading and posts loading is equal to this dot props. We're just wanting to get them off of our props. And we're going to say if loading dot user, or actually if user loading is equal to undefined, we're going to want to get our user. And we're going to want to do the same thing with posts loading. If posts loading is undefined, we're going to get posts. Very simple. Hopefully this makes sense. If we haven't tried to load the user before, try and load the user. If we haven't loaded the post before, try and load the posts. And our component will receive props. We're going to say if next props dot posts loading is -1 and next props dot user is not equal to null, this dot props dot get posts. So I explained this a little bit earlier, but I'll run over it again very quickly. Is if we've tried to load the posts and couldn't because we weren't authenticated, wait until our user is not equal to null, which means we are authenticated, and try and get the posts again. And in our render function, we're going to do const user loading and posts loading is equal to this dot props. We're going to do if. So we're going to say if not user and if not posts. Oh, sorry. User loading and posts loading. So if we are done loading with both of them, or this.props.user is null, which means that we've loaded the user and we weren't authenticated, which means that we can't get our posts, we're going to return this.props.children, which we can actually clean up a little bit more up here. I think I have a stray curly brace. Oh. What is it mad about? I think I'm missing a curly brace. Oh, it's not curly braces for returning JSX. There we go. So we've said if we're loading, or if we're done loading, return the children. Otherwise, return, and we're just going to do a div of loading dot dot dot. So what we've said is if we're loading or done loading, return the children. If we're loading, return loading. Very, very simple. So this is our loading component. We're going to go ahead and attach or put that in above our switch statement. We're going to do loading component. We're going to do the same thing down here. And we're going to make sure to import the loading component. Get our tab on. So that's our loading component. Should be very simple. We're going to have all of our posts or our user whenever we get to anything else, unless it's the login page, obviously. So next, we're going to do our authenticated component. So we're going to go to containers, new, JavaScript file, authenticated component. This is also going to be a class-based component, so we're going to import components from React, import component. That's a rough word. I struggle with that one. We're going to import connect from react-redux, and we're going to import with router from React router DOM. Now we're going to start our component. So authenticated component extends component, and we're going to have a component did update and a render method. And then we're going to have a map state to props. We're going to return. Our user is going to be our state.user. And our user loading is going to equal state.loading.user. And that's it. And then we're going to also need to export default with router. Again, to make sure that we're connected to React router. Connect map state to props. Ooh, not map. Map state to props. And we don't have any action creators. And then we're going to do authenticated component. And that should be that. Make sure everything's formatted correctly. And our component will update. We're going to need to check to make sure we're done loading. In our component did update, we're going to need to make sure that we're done loading and we have a user. Otherwise, we need to redirect to the login page, because in this message board, it's super secret and you have to have a login to see the posts. Unlike, most message boards. So we're going to do const user loading and posts. Oh, we don't actually need post loading. So we're going to get const user loading. So we go to this.props. And we're also going to need to get the user. And then we're going to say if user loading is false and there is no user, we're going to do this.props.history.push login. So what we've said here, if we're done loading and there's no user, go back to the login page. That's it. That's all we needed to do. So whenever we render, we're going to get user, children, and user loading from this.props. We're then going to say return if user is done loading and there is a user, return children, otherwise return null. Ooh. Sorry, user loading. So we've said if we're done loading and we have a user, go ahead and render the rest of the components. Otherwise, return null and wait and make sure that we need to push back to the user loading or push back to the login page or render our children. So for this, we're also going to need to go into the index.js, and we're going to wrap this one around our home component because that's the component we want to make sure we're authenticated in. So authenticated component, I do believe is what I made it. I did name it that. Ooh, I apologize for the thunder. Too spooky for me. Okay. Now that we're done with that, we're going to need to go back into our login component. And this will be the end of it. We're going to get rid of our component will receive props because we're going to know that we have data now before we ever get to this component. So we're going to say component will mount because we've got the data. We're going to say if this.props.user is not equal to null, this.props.push back to our home, or this.props.history.push .push. What we've said is if we have a user logged in, push back to the home directory. Now let's give this a run. Ooh. Hopefully that isn't too spooky for you. Let's give this a run and see what we've got. Now, if we do, I've already made it a thing for mine, but try and log in. We pushed and we logged in just fine. We can still make posts. Our data works just fine. We'll sign back out. We'll sign with Google. Why not? Make sure that it works with Google. Perfect. So you can see here that we have a console warning. I'm going to go ahead and fix that. I made the error last time because I just copy and pasted the code from the documentation for the social buttons. But all it is in social media login, instead of an ahref, we are just going to do a button. And we're going to do a type is equal to button, because if you don't do that, it'll submit the form, which you don't want it to do. And that should make that warning go away. And with that, we're done. Very simple. I haven't seen too many videos on this topic. I struggled quite a bit to find it myself or figure it out myself. But this is how you can do like ng-guard in Angular. Basically, we're guarding components so they can't log in, or they can't hit them if they're not logged in. And also what we're doing is we're loading all of our data before we ever get to these components. So this could be very useful if you had, if I wanted to load all my stuff before I ever got somewhere. Like for us, we want to make sure that we load our posts before we ever get to our post page. And you can add a cool little spinner. That's what I've done on my main branch. But you can take this a little further, have like a nav bar at the top and just the loading at the bottom. It's endless, but right now, what you've accomplished is very, very useful. It reduces the amount of duplicated code, because now we never have to check for authentication again because our component does that ourselves. All we're going to have to do is go into the authenticated component and paste our route in there. And that's what we're going to do next time, is we're going to have like a listed post that's going to have all the comments and give you the ability to comment. So we're going to be able soon to look at another page, and we're going to make sure that it's going to be hidden behind our authenticated component. As you can see, that really reduces our duplicated code. So I want to thank you guys for watching. Like and subscribe. Comment if you have any comments, questions, or concerns. I know that one concern has been that my text is very small. I bumped it up quite a bit this time. If it's still too small, let me know. Again, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time.